Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
The Jean Nicholas Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies at the University of Minnesota Libraries is wrapping up the first phase of its Transgender Oral History project. The project, which includes over 200 interviews with transgender individuals of all ages and races, can be seen as an exhibit at the Elmer L. Anderson Library. Videos can be viewed online. This month, Access Minnesota sat down with the project's oral historian, Andrea Jenkins, to discuss the importance of documenting the stories of transgender people in their own words. Andrea Jenkins is the oral historian for the Jean Nicholas Tretter Collection in Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Studies at the University of Minnesota Libraries. In their own words, the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project is currently on view at the Elmer L. Anderson Library Gallery now through January 31st. Give us an overview of the Oral History Project. How did you go about gathering a wide range of transgender voices from across the upper Midwest?
Well, hello, Jim, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I really have a strong network of people who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. And so it really was less of a recruitment process and more of a curatorial process. We were really wanting to make sure that we included voices from the military community or transgender veterans. We wanted to make sure we had disabled, trans-identified people, people of color, immigrants. And so in order to show a wide breadth of the community. And so part of the work was to really reach out to those specific communities. But in terms of recruitment, it wasn't a real heavy recruitment sale. One of the things that I did do early on in the process is that I would take selfies after the interviews and I would post those up on social media. And I think that became somewhat of a recruitment tool, if you will. That wasn't the necessary intent, but I think people seeing those selfies, seeing who was being interviewed, prompted others to either reach out to me and say they wanted to be a part of it, or when I asked people, they had already kind of seen the buzz around it and were willing to be involved.
Did you generally find that people were eager to share their stories, or were some reluctant to talk to you?
Generally speaking, people were really, really eager. The transgender community has been so marginalized, so sort of on the fringes of society for so long that I think there was a lot of pent-up frustration for people to share their stories and to be open and authentic about their lives with a broader audience. So yeah, there was a lot of eagerness to participate.
A number of human rights groups have noted that violence against transgender people in the U.S. is on the rise. Were there people who wanted to tell their stories but feared the dangers that trans people are currently facing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you noted that, Jim. And it just so happens that yesterday was Transgender Day of Remembrance, which acknowledges the horrific, sad, traumatic deaths of transgender people each year, and it's been going on for about 18 years. This year so far, 26 people have been murdered in the United States, and over 100 plus people all over the world. And it's really disturbing that people are being, targets of violence simply because of who they are. I know for a fact that many people that I've interviewed talk about it in their interviews. I've had people be more reluctant that their family members may see the stories, and they may face some discrimination from that aspect, but less about the violence. I think people are beginning to just become more comfortable with themselves and consequently more comfortable being out in public. That being said, it is still a dangerous and sort of tenuous path for transgender people.
Give us an overview of the process you went about to ensure that the participants in the Oral History Project represented a wide variety of ages, ethnicities, and races.
Right. So, and it's like 18 to 93, and 27 veterans, and 40 plus African American people, and over 60 white identified trans people, Latinos. There's one of the interviews that is really quite fascinating to me is we interviewed a deaf American, and they preferred deaf over hearing impaired, but they signed the interview, and their interpreter spoke the words on tape, which is kind of a different way of doing that, but it was really fascinating. It's really about being intentional. When there was an immigrant woman, an undocumented immigrant woman who came to town to speak here in Minneapolis, and I saw the invite that she was going to be here speaking, and I called her up, and to make sure that we had those sort of undocumented immigrant voices as a part of the histories, because I know that they exist. And so it's really about being intentional and sort of keeping track of the metadata too, so we know where we stand. But that was pretty much the process.
The Transgender Oral History Project revealed that many subjects see themselves across a gender spectrum. When Access Minnesota returns, we take a look at the many ways transgender people identify their gender and sexuality.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now, back to our conversation with Andrea Jenkins, oral historian for the Jean Nicholas Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies at the University of Minnesota Libraries. She talks about the new exhibit, In Their Own Words. How did the participants view their gender and sexuality? Did you find a range of how members of the trans community saw themselves?
Absolutely. It is fascinating to me. I learned so much in being involved in this process. There are more than two genders out there that people are identifying with, from bigender to agender, meaning I have no gender, to some people identify themselves as masculine of center, and so they're not really male, but they are, this is their own description, but they are more masculine than what we traditionally and historically think of women, and they own that masculinity. So we have a board downstairs in the exhibition that you mentioned, in Their Own Words, where we have people put stars next to the genders that they identify with, and there is a predominance of stars on the male and female, but there are many, many, many stars on all of the other gender identities that people have sort of named in their own words. And in fact, we also have a video of just people stating their gender identities, and it's about 40 people in the video, and they all are naming a different gender.
What questions were asked in the interviews?
You know, we tried to go with a standard set of questions, recognizing that all of the answers were going to be pretty different, but just to have some level of continuity. So, you know, I would start out with a question like, what's the first thing you remember in life? Just to kind of get people's memory banks working. You know, I would ask about their childhood growing up. I would ask about relationships. I would ask people, what are the joys? What are the challenges of living a truly authentic, living in your true authentic gender? What do they see as the future of the transgender community? What kinds of issues should the community be addressing as a whole? You know, ask questions about their medical status. When is the first time they ever met a transgender person? You know, just trying to get at a deeper level than most people are able to share.
What did you learn during the interviewing process about the common struggles and discrimination faced by people in the trans community?
You know, it may not come as a surprise, but family is a really tough area for people. It, you know, becomes even more complicated for people who come out later in life and they have children and marriages and those kinds of things. That creates a lot of pain for people. One of the things, though, that was really quite fascinating to me in asking about the joys, almost to a person, people said, the freedom to be myself. Overwhelmingly was the response.
The oldest participant of the project was 90 years old, the youngest 18. Did you find much difference in the stories based upon the age of the participant?
I think the younger folks are just way more aggressive, maybe is a term, or they're out there, they're in your face. This is who I am. You must use these pronouns. You must recognize and respect. And I get that, and I absolutely respect that. I think a lot of older folks are much more tolerant in terms of people accepting them. They're willing to give people a little more time in order to adjust, and it is an adjustment for your family and for all the people involved. The older people were impacted by the society that we live in, and so consequently much more reluctant to actually come out, and they lived a lot of their journey sort of in the closet, if you will, behind the scenes, and the younger folks, I mean, they're out at 16 years old, and they have support from their families to access medical help, and it's almost like night and day. It really is much less of a emotional struggle, at least from the folks that I talked to, much less of an emotional struggle than I think some of the older folks have experienced.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll look at the role Minnesota has played in the transgender community.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
The University of Minnesota Hospital was the second in the country to offer gender reassignment surgery. Here's more on the history of Minnesota's role in transgender health and policy. What role does Minnesota play in these oral histories? Has our state been a relatively supportive place for the trans community?
Great question. Minnesota has played a significant role in the transgender movement, I would say, overall. The University of Minnesota was the second university in the country to offer gender confirmation surgery. At the time, they called it sexual reassignment surgery. After Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And that was in 1967, I believe, when they started. Minnesota was the first state in the country to include transgender identities in their human rights language in 1993. Minneapolis was the first city to include transgender people in their human rights ordinance in 1975, I believe. So in terms of policies and legislation, Minnesota has certainly been a welcoming place, as well as offering medical assistance and services to transgender identified people. It was very much in the forefront. Several professors and physicians here in Minnesota have been the presidents of the formerly Harry Benjamin Association for Gender Identity, which sets the standards of care for how do you treat transgender patients, whether that's for psychologists or for medical providers. That organization has now been renamed the WPATH, or the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. But again, several presidents of that organization, it's an international organization, were here in Minnesota. So I think Minnesota has played a large role in the medical transgender movement, but also in the social movement as well, by enacting some of those laws and policies, which has given my people like myself an opportunity to rise up in various employment settings and not fear for the loss of my job, or and certainly people do lose their jobs because of their gender identity here in Minnesota, but there's actual there is legislation to protect them if they choose to pursue that. And I think that creates more of an atmosphere for people to pursue opportunities that they may not otherwise pursue in communities where it is not as open.
How do you hope this project will be used by future scholars and historians?
Well, I hope that, as more and more people begin to, become aware of transgender individuals in our culture and society, and then begin to tell those stories, that they don't necessarily rely on their own sort of perceptions of who transgender people are, but they can use this resource, this database of over 200 stories from trans and gender nonconforming people as a guide to some of the struggles, some of the issues, some of the joys. I mean, it is not a life of doom and gloom for most of the people that I've interviewed. People have happy, productive lives. People have family lives, relationships, and so I hope that students and scholars and journalists and filmmakers and novelists and researchers will use this as a primary source material to hear directly from transgender people, to be able to tell those stories more authentically.
What do you hope the trans community in particular will get out of this project?
A sense of empowerment, a sense of hope, a sense of community, from understanding that, because so many trans people, I heard in doing these interviews, when they were younger, they thought they were like the only person in the world that was dealing with these issues. And I can personally speak for myself. I really thought the same exact thing. So, empowerment, a sense of community, a sense of hope, and a sense of pride that, these stories are being preserved in this world-class university, and that they will be protected and archived for many, 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 many years to come. And I hope that people can get some pride from that knowledge.
Tell us about the next phase of the project.
So the next phase of the project is really interesting, and I'm really proud that, the success of phase 1 was able to help, phase 2 come to fruition. But the next phase of the project is to really go out and talk to what we're calling movement leaders, people who have been on the visible and on the front lines of policy change, creating awareness about the issues that impact the transgender community, organizations like the Human Rights Campaign or the Center for Transgender Equality, and there have been so many more organizations that have been created in the past 10 years or so. And so we want to really capture those stories, those significant leaders and people who have really contributed to the progress of the transgender community. So that's phase 2.
Andrea Jenkins is the oral historian for the Jean Nicholas Tretter Collection in Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Studies at the University of Minnesota Libraries. In their own words, the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project is currently on view in the Elmer L. Anderson Gallery through January 31st. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you, Jim. It's been my pleasure.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.